Okay, so now we've got a task 1 essay. So we're looking at a line graph, and we're showing the graph below shows average carbon dioxide emissions per person, the United Kingdom, Sweden, Italy and Portugal between 1967 and 2007. Summarize the information, select and report the main features, make comparisons. Okay, so when you look at the question, it's like, okay, what do we want to do? They want us to compare and they want us to summarize. Okay, no problem. The other thing I always tell candidates to look at, check the dates. This is a really common mistake in task 1. What tense are you using? It's between 1967 and 2007, so everything should be in the past. Okay, everything should be past tense. Check out the information on the graph. So we've got 4 countries, so there's lots of comparisons that you can make here. You can make comparisons between each country over the whole period, or you can make comparisons over time. Okay, so there's 2 different ways to make comparisons. So let's have a look and see what this candidate did. So we've got the given line graph indicated. So I said everything should be in the past, but except when you're talking about the graph, we're looking at it now in the present tense. So the given line graph indicates the figure for consumption of carbon dioxide in 4 countries. Is it consumption? Consumption is you're taking something in, you're using something. This is carbon emissions. So this is the carbon that's coming out of the country per person, okay? So this isn't consumption, this isn't using carbon dioxide, this is producing, okay? So the question says emissions per person, the figure for, there's not really a good paraphrase for emissions. If you said emissions of, that's sort of, you've changed the order of the word, so that's okay. Emissions of carbon dioxide in 4 countries should be the United Kingdom. This isn't semicolon, isn't correct if you're listing. It should be a colon. It should be 2 spots. The United Kingdom, Sweden, Italy, and Portugal over 4 decades from 1967 to 2007. I like they tried to paraphrase 4 decades. I thought that was a nice paraphrase. Consumption of carbon dioxide, yeah. So it was just a slight issue or misunderstanding of what the word emissions mean. Okay, so this is their paraphrase. I thought was reasonable. Okay, they've tried to do a paraphrase. Then what they've got here is that they've got paragraph, and then they've got paragraph because they're indenting. So for me, that's first thing is I'm thinking this feels a weird use of paragraphing. Usually you put the paraphrase and the overview sentence together in one paragraph. Or you make your overview slightly longer. I think this sentence, paragraph, sentence, paragraph, sentence, paragraph, looks a bit strange and isn't really the correct use of paragraphing. Okay, so that's going to affect your cohesion and coherence score. So I would tell this candidate just to stick these 2 sentences together and it looks more like a paragraph. So in the overview, they say it is clearly seen that during the given period, Italy and Portugal gradually increased. So this what does Italy and Portugal gradually increase? This sentence literally means the country of Italy got bigger. The country of Portugal got bigger, okay? That's not what this candidate means, okay? So you need to tell me what increased. Increased their emission of carbon dioxide. Increased their CO2 emissions. Okay, something like that. What increased? However, turning to the United Kingdom and Sweden, which are dropped brackets respectively. However, so this should be a small t. I quite like this transition. However, turning to the United Kingdom and Sweden, but then they let me down in the second half of the sentence, which are drop bracket respectively. I don't really know what this candidate means. I can't. I looked at it and I was like, can I fix it? And I was like, I don't know if I can fix it because I don't know what you're trying to say. So I think what you're trying to say is that over this whole period, United Kingdom and Sweden's emissions dropped respectively. However, turning to the United Kingdom and Sweden, you have to say something like their emissions dropped. And then when you use respectively is when you say the United Kingdom and Sweden, their emissions, you'd have to give a figure, dropped by, 50% and 20%, and then you would add respectively, okay? Because that tells you 50% was the United Kingdom and 20% was Sweden, okay? If you don't have respectively, you know, maybe the United Kingdom was 20%, Sweden dropped by 50%, okay? But when you add respectively, it means that these are listed in the same order as the first half of the sentence. Okay, so they've not really used respectively correctly, although I appreciate that they've tried to use a more high-level word, okay? So then we move on to, in detail, the figure for the United Kingdom. Started at above 11 and distributed over the given period. Okay, so the issue here is they started at above 11. 11 is just the number, but it's not actually 11. If we look at the side of the graph, it's 11 metric tons of CO2, okay? So I know that they've gone for this number here, but they've not looked to see what does the number mean. It's not actually 11 of what? Started at above 11 metric tons of CO2 per person and steadily decreased over the given period. This is good, steadily decreased. Yeah, that's perfectly fine. However, the rate of Sweden peaked is not the right word here. I think they tried to say peaked, I think, was what they're going for, like it sort of peaked. But to check that, I have to go back and look at the graph, and like, did it peak at 10.5 in 1997? So we've got Sweden. Yeah, so then I have to go back and check. I'm like, oh yeah, this candidate did mean to say peaked, not picked. That's not a good sign if it's confused. Where's the line between I know what you mean and it makes it harder for the reader? If something, your mistake makes it more difficult for the reader to understand, if I have to go back and check the data and then come back and reread your sentence and then work out what you meant, okay? That's when your spelling or your word choice actually creates a hindrance to the reader or makes it more difficult for the reader to understand what you're trying to say. So that's where you sort of get knocked down from the sort of band 5 lower. However, the rate of Sweden peaked at about to 10.5 in 97, so we're saying the same issue here is 11. After that, the proportion fell dramatically for the remaining period. Okay, not a problem. We've got a spelling issue here, but that's fine. I know what they meant. So if we go on to the next sentence, we've got turning to Italy, which stood at just over 4 and steeply rose to about 6.5. Steeply rose good until 1997. Plus that graph maintained the same level for 10 years again. This is a weird sentence fragment. I have to think hard. What do they mean? Plus that graph maintained. I'm gonna guess that they're trying to say Italy stayed the same for the next 10 years. I think that's what they meant. I think the confusing issue is that graph. I think this is incorrect. And the candidate needs to change that to the correct phrase so I know what they're talking about. Also, Portugal too, the amount of CO2 in Portugal climbed significantly until 1997. Okay, so climbed significantly, good. After that, it can be represented mere increased movement between 1997. Now the issue here, mere increased movement. So again, I have to go back and I have to check the graph. I'm like, mere means like a small amount or just increased. So what I think this candidate is trying to say is that it can be Italy's amount didn't really change between 1997 and 2007. Okay, so you could say something like after that, Italy's CO2 emissions leveled out, sort of stayed the same or barely, if I can even spell, barely fluctuated, something like that. Mere increased movement is not a combination of words that has any meaning, so I can't tell what you mean. So again, this is another situation where I read the sentence, I don't know what they mean, so then I have to go back and I have to look at the graph, and I'm like, okay, I think what they meant is that it didn't change. So I have to go back and check so I can understand what you meant, which is not a good sign. So what I want to see here is I've got this issue between they've not really given me enough detail, they've not really given me enough overview of the big picture or picked out the main trends. You know, they have in this overview, they have tried to give me a little bit of comparison, which is what the question asked for, but not really enough. So I want to see them, you know, pick out something like the country with the most dramatic change in CO2 emissions was blah, 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 blah. Or the most obvious feature is that, you know, in all countries, CO2 emissions dropped over this period, or something like that. Like a bigger overall statement is what I'd want to see. So when we go to scoring, that's what would affect their task achievements. I give them a 5 for task achievements. They do try and address the task, but I need more detail and more accurate detail, like that's clearly taken from the graphs. They need to talk about metric tons, CO2 emissions, and not just giving me these numbers. And I want more comparisons, or more structured comparisons as well. Okay, not just look at the UK, look at Sweden, look at Italy, look at Portugal. You know, more integrated comparisons. Both the UK and Sweden did this, however, Portugal and Italy did this. Or in this period between 1960 and 1970, these 3 countries increased. The only country to decrease was Italy, or something like that. Like more integrated, more detailed comparisons would help this candidate. That would also help their coherence and cohesion score. My main issue with their coherence was their paragraphing, because I couldn't see what was the clear reason for splitting the paragraphs like they did. So they split it into the UK and Sweden and Italy and Portugal, but I don't know what was the reason that they chose to divide them like that. There's no, these are the 2 countries that increased, these are the 2 countries that decreased, or these are the 2 countries with the biggest change, these are the 2 countries that didn't really change. Those would be reasons for grouping them as they did. There was no clear reason for their paragraphing, so I couldn't really give them much for coherence and cohesion. Vocabulary. There were errors in word choice. Your errors in vocabulary made it difficult for me to understand your meaning. Several times I had to go back and check on the graph picture to work out what you were trying to say. Okay, so for this candidate, that was affected the vocabulary score. And the same for the grammar. There was a couple of sentences, like I pointed out when I was reading, that were very difficult for me to understand what you meant, and were difficult for me to fix because I wasn't sure what you meant. And so these are errors that cause a problem for the reader. Okay? A problem 4. If you cause a problem for the reader, that really means it's going to be difficult for you to get a band 5. So I would really encourage this candidate first to focus on their grammar, and also think more about their cohesion. Okay? So if they could structure better paragraphing, create a sort of better, more detailed comparisons, that would really help their score. So overall, coming out at a 4 overall, but I think there's a lot of room for this candidate to improve. Especially if they fix some of the errors in their vocabulary, I think that would really bump their score up as well. So that would be my main advice for them.